Hey, comic fans, thank you for joining us. Dave here at Ground Zero, talking all things comics and all things comics history. Now, the history of comics, especially where it pertains to sales, has been marked by repeated cycles of boom and bust. The prosperity boom of the 1940s, that was the golden age, was followed by the 1950s, where anti-comic crusades led to canceled titles, publishers going out of business, and sales decreases across the board. The superhero revival of the 1960s and the whole Marvel revolution was followed by the stagnant sales of the 70s, as the comic industry had no idea where it was going and didn't even think it would make it out of the decade. But make it out they did, and the 1980s was an amazing period that was marked by so much growth and success, the growth of the direct market, all the new independent publishers that came in. It was a great period. And so it's logical that it would follow that the 90s would be a period of retrenchment. But that's not exactly how it happened. Instead, what we got was the 1990s, a decade that had everything. It was marked by incredible peaks, the likes of which comic industry had never seen. And that, of course, set up the mother of all comic book bust. And that's part of what we're going to cover today, interestingly enough. Now, today's topic was suggested to us by Brent McClendon, who writes in, "Hey Dave, tell us about the great comic crash of the 1990s. Brent, that's an excellent topic. Thank you so much. You have great taste in topics. Now, we've all heard the Chinese proverb / Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Now, interestingly enough, that probably didn't originate in China. For one thing, as written, that proverb can't be directly translated into Chinese. But even more importantly, it's only been traced back to the mid-20th century to a British statesman who used it mistakenly, believing it was Chinese. But whatever its origin, it was a very apt description of the comic industry coming out of the 1980s. As 1989 ended, there were 73 different publishers putting out comic books. There was more than a dozen distributors, many of them regional, some of them national, all getting those books to hungry comic book stores. The direct market was healthy, it was robust, and it was into this market and into this time that Marvel came along and just launched a marketing offensive, the likes of which we had never seen before. They generated a tidal wave of cash, and they increased public exposure of their characters that was so great that it led to what we have today. But more importantly, for this discussion, was instrumental in setting up the fall that was to come. And it all started with a movie, but not a Marvel movie. It was this movie. Batman from Tim Burton arrived in the summer of 1989. Warner Brothers had been promising this for a long time. The anticipation was high, and it absolutely delivered and was an instant success. It had what at the time was the biggest opening day weekend ever. And it was on its way to generating $100 million in ticket sales. Now, there's two takeaways from this movie. One is it really started the job that had been started a decade earlier with the Superman film, and that was to make comic book movies safe for the regular movie-going public. Nothing campy, nothing nichey, just good superhero movies, and that led to what we've got today in the huge boom in superhero films. But more important for this discussion is the second effect it had, and that was in merchandising. It was a merchandising bonanza. Batman action figures, play sets, t-shirts, jackets, Bat cereal, Bat tortilla chips. Everything was out there, and the public gobbled it up like there was, frankly, no tomorrow. All this revenue generated $750 million in sales. That's $750 million, all just in ancillary merchandising. Now, this was going to get some people's attention, and it did. It got one person's attention in particular by the name of Ron Perlman. Now, Ron Perlman was not a comic creator. He had nothing to do with that aspect of the business. But what he was in 1989, he was a very rich man, and he got that way by being a corporate raider. He was notorious for buying businesses that he thought were undervalued. Now, in the 80s, Marvel was owned by New World Pictures. It's Roger Corman's outfit that mostly made B films. He had bought it in 1986 for $46 million, but just 2 years later, he was in a cash flow crunch and Marvel was up for sale. Well, Ron Perlman knew a good deal when he saw it, and he jumped in and bought the outfit for $82.5 million. Now, Perlman was not a comics fan. In fact, he said in an interview that he didn't even understand how to read comics. But what he did know was money, and he installed people similar to him throughout upper management of Marvel. It was people that were not fans, were not creators. They didn't know comic books, but what they did know was money and how to make a lot of it. And one of the first things they did was ask for more product, in particular, more number ones. This brings us to 1980. Todd McFarlane was drawing The Amazing Spider-Man, and under his tenure, that book had grown in leaps and bounds and was one of Marvel's best-selling titles. But McFarlane was feeling kind of stagnant, and he had wanted to write comics. He'd never done it before, but that's what he wanted to do. He finally asked to be released from Spider-Man, and he expected that they would bump him down to an insignificant, lower-selling title for him to learn his trade and get better at writing. What he didn't expect was the offer they came back with, and that was, we're going to create an all-new, extra, fourth Spider-Man title. You're going to write it, you're going to draw it, and we're all going to make a lot of money. He couldn't turn that offer down, and so sure enough, in late summer of 1990, they came out with this adjectiveless Spider-Man title. Now, there were multiple versions of this. This particular cover was designed for the newsstands, and then they colored it differently for the direct market. So hopefully people would go both places to buy those copies. But then somebody had the idea of, hey, for the newsstand version, how about if we release yet another one and seal it in a poly bag? That way when Joe Collector goes up to buy a copy, he can get one that he knows that obnoxious, annoying kid whose mom's off trying to decide between shampoo hasn't sat there and read through and dog-eared pages. If it's sealed in a poly bag, you know it's mint, and we want these books to be mint, and we want to sell more copies. Well, once that came out, then the direct market said, hey, we want a polybagged version too, so they got a polybag version. So there was at least 4 versions, and really there was more, but there was multiple versions of this title. Now, records from the early days of comic sales are pretty sketchy. We don't have real exact ones. But the research that Marvel did said that the best-selling single issue of all time was somewhere in 1948. It was a 1948 issue of Captain Marvel Adventures, who, as we've already discussed in another segment, was the most popular superhero at that time. And that book sold a whopping 1.7 million copies. That's a lot, but these books were 10 cents at that time, and they were everywhere. Every newsstand, drugstore had copies of this book, and every kid bought them. So surely, a current book in the 90s was not going to hit those kind of numbers, but it did hit them. It not only hit them, it did almost twice as many copies sold. It ultimately sold close to 3 million copies. Marvel was ecstatic. Todd McFarlane got a nice hefty check, and everything was great because this was a record, an absolute sales record that was going to last for a year. Because 1 year later, we get X-Force #1. Now, Rob Liefeld was drawing New Mutants, but he was a little unhappy with the direction of the book. He and the writer did not really see eye to eye, and he was creating all sorts of giant, huge, gun-toting characters. And so he suggested X-Force, all new group, all new Liefeld attitude, and Marvel's all too happy to oblige. And they came up with the idea of, let's polybag them. And not only will we polybag them, we'll polybag them with a trading card. And there'll be 5 trading cards. So fans, you've got to buy 5 copies of this book. No, wait. You've got to buy 6 copies of this book. 1 for each trading card sealed in the polybag, and then 1 to open up and read. Really, no, you don't have to read that one. Just take the 5 copies and be done. You'll be happier, really. So, this book came out, and with all the different variations and people buying to get the complete set of cards, sold 4 million copies. Already, Todd McFarlane's record had fallen. This record was going to last for 2 months. Because 2 months later, we get adjectiveless X-Men. Now, this is all in 1991. They are riding incredibly high. This book, Jim Lee, Chris Claremont, super popular creators, it sells an unbelievable 8.1 million copies. Marvel is absolutely printing money. In 1991, of the top 100 comics, 91 of them were Marvel. 91 out of the top 100. That is an amazing stretch. They were literally printing money. Now, coincidentally, in this same year of 1991, Rob Liefeld, Jim Valentino, Eric Larson, all Marvel Comics creators, were at the San Diego Comic-Con, and they decided to go have dinner with Malibu publisher Dave Olbrich. Now, Malibu was a small, plucky little publisher that had managed to survive the black and white boom and bust of the mid-1980s. They were small, but they were a survivor. Now, Dave Olbrich had made an offer a few years earlier to Rob Liefeld. You create a book for us, we'll publish it. Well, by this point, Liefeld's reputation had grown and his ego had grown. And so at this dinner, he suggested to Dave Olbrich, if that offer still holds, how about if we create a separate imprint? One for creators of the stature of us. Olbrich agreed. And not only that, he agreed to publish books by Rob Liefeld's buddies, Jim Valentino and Eric Larson. And Image Comics was born. And before it was all done, before it was even launched, Todd McFarlane would join them, as would Jim Lee. This was huge news, and the comic industry was just riding high. So, 1992, these Image books start coming out. Now, the biggest launch and the one most awaited was Todd McFarlane's new creation, Spawn. It sold 1.7 million copies. It's not Marvel numbers, but it's a staggering number for an independently produced and distributed comic book. This was huge, and not only that, since he owned the property, he made more money on the 1.7 million copies of this than he made selling almost twice as many of Spider-Man #1. Everybody was happy. Now, Valiant, meanwhile, is doing what Valiant did, and we've already talked about Valiant. Now, as we start that year, they were selling 25,000 to 30,000 copies an issue. Respectable numbers, but nobody was getting rich. Well, that's when Jim Shooter worked his magic and Unity came out. And Unity was a 2-month crossover starting in August of that year. By the end of that crossover, Valiant Comics had increased to 5 times that number. They were selling really well, and all of a sudden, they were starting to get rich. Well, getting rich is what this particular part of the story is all about, and that brings us to DC. Because DC decided in November 17th of 1992 to pull out its biggest gun and kill him. Now, they had killed characters before. This is a device that's happened so often in comic books, but this was going to be huge news because the media just ran with it as a story. Superman, the iconic American institution, is dead with a capital D, to never come back. This is an important landmark. Speculated who were waiting for something like this, all of a sudden that aligned with the media frenzy. And we had a book that everybody wanted. Lines stretched out the door. They bought 6 million copies of this book. And not only did they buy them, it was instantly selling for many times what they paid for it. It was quickly going for $30 a book. Now, if you still have a copy of this, you're not going to get $30. But the frenzy is the important thing, because the frenzy is what this story is about. And that brings us to 1993. In 1993, the baseball card market collapsed. Now, the baseball card market had been very robust, with as many as 12,000 baseball and sports memorabilia shops across the U.S. at one point. Why it collapsed is too big to get into here, but suffice to say it did, and a lot of those people who were collecting baseball cards turned to comics now instead. So all of a sudden, comic shops were ordering comics for even more people, and some baseball card shops started carrying comics in their shops. Now, these were people who didn't care about the characters, who weren't comics readers. What they wanted was another collectible, and so comics started being viewed not as entertainment, not as an art form, but as something strictly to collect, and that's important. Now, in February of 1993, retailers ordered a very large 190 million copies of books. But just 2 months later, in April, that number had increased to 400 million. These numbers were huge. The bubble was blowing up. Overall, in 1992, the comic industry did an amazing $500 million in total sales. In 1993, that number had increased to a staggering 800 million. And a big part of that was Image. Now, Image had left and formed with Malibu Comics, and Malibu was doing a lot of the work and process printing their books. However, Image wasn't happy. Their deal with Malibu was that Image creators would get all the money from licensing and all that sort of stuff, but Malibu would take 10% for printing and distributing the books. It was a 90-10 split. Well, all of a sudden, the Image creators looked up and said, "We don't think that's enough." Eric Larson said in an interview at the time, "It just seemed to us that even at a 90-10 split, what is Malibu doing? We don't need them. It's not that complicated." Turns out, yes, it actually was kind of that complicated. So they leave Malibu and start handling all that other stuff on their own. And Image Unshackled goes absolutely wild. There are dozens of new titles. Now, if you've got your phone screen set to bright, you might want to turn it down. Same thing if you got a computer, because it's the 90s and it's about to get really, really shiny. Image starts releasing tons of new books, like Shaman's Tears, like Sam Keith's The Max. We get Shadowhawk 2. Jim Lee comes out with another title, Death Blow. Union. Notice the trend here? Union. And this one, Tribe. Let's face it, how many of you remember Tribe? Did you expect that one coming? Tribe. And it's a foil enhanced black cool cover. It's the 90s. Now, they're doing great with all of this stuff, but at least in the creating end of the books. But all the other stuff that Malibu is doing, Image isn't doing so well. In fact, in 1993, they shipped less than 33% of their books on time. This was huge and put a lot of comic shops in a bad position because they had money tied up in product that wasn't arriving on time, and oftentimes fans didn't want it by the time it finally did arrive. Now, shifting over to DC Comics, they were creating a little bit of shine and gloss of their own. Superman, remember him? He's dead. He got better. And a shiny chromium cover will certainly help you get better really quickly. They were doing really well with their Superman line, despite the fact that the death now was kind of an afterthought thing. But there we are, Superman doing really well. Well, if Superman's going to get better, hey, maybe we can do something to Batman. And so they did. As they approached the 500th issue, they broke his back and they replaced him with a new, much more violent, gritty character. But more importantly, where DC is concerned is Milestone. Creators Dennis Cohen and Dwayne McDuffie looked at comics and said they were tired of the all-white cast. And so they formed Milestone, which was to be Comic Company's first minority-owned publisher. Now, they went to Paul Levitz, the publisher of DC, and offered him a deal. How about if you distribute our books? DC agreed, and the deal was Milestone would control all copyrights, have all creative output, they would control it, they would control any merchandising. All DC did was print, distribute the books, which they would license for an annual fee. Everybody was happy. So Milestone books start getting released, and oh look, DC can get on this game too. Polybagged with stuff. Trading card probably. Polybagged. But either way, you had to buy at least a couple of copies because you wanted to keep that bag sealed or it wasn't mint. Now, Dwayne McDuffie was happy. Dennis Cohen was happy because they got their universe. Everybody got their universe because there's plenty to go around. Malibu, now that they don't have Image, Ultraverse. They come up with their own comic book universe. As I mentioned in another segment, Dark Horse comes out with their own universe, Comics Greatest World, which was not. Jim Shooter, remember him? He's no longer at Valiant at this point, but he's not done, and he creates Defiant Comics, and their title, Warriors of Plasm, comes out. And that could be another whole topic but still, it comes out. There are so many new things coming out, everybody's doing happy, which has to bring us to Deathmate. Because yes, you knew that was coming. Deathmate, it was the first company crossover since 1983's X-Men Teen Titans. It was a big deal. It couldn't miss. Steve Mazursky and Jim Lee were buddies. They put it together. It was going to break all sales records, surely. Lots of stuff went wrong. In the first place, there were two questions. Would it be good? And would it ship on time? Well, the answer to the first question is no. Because Valiant, for all of their efforts, didn't talk to Bob Layton, and he was their creative director. He didn't like the idea. He felt it was absolutely shoved down their throats. He didn't like it, and he didn't know what to do with it. But he did his best. Now, did it ship on time? Oh no. Now, the deal between the two companies was that they would work jointly on a prologue and an epilogue. That would be produced by both and created by both. But then in between, there would be 4 prestige format specials, 2 published by Valiant and 2 published by Image. The Valiant books came out on time. They did Deathmate Blue and Deathmate Yellow. They came out on time, although in all frankness, content-wise, they just kind of meandered because, like I said, Bob Layton just had no idea what to do with this particular series. Image books, on the other hand, were late. They were supposed to ship in the summer of 1993. Deathmate Black actually wound up shipping in October of 1993. And even more egregious, Rob Liefeld's version, Deathmate Red, shipped in December, 4 months after it was supposed to ship. Nobody cared by that point. Nobody cared. These books you can find in the back room of every comic shop in existence. When we made grab bags, one of my customers used to comment, they're not 20 comics for $8. They're 18 comics and 2 Deathmates. That's how ambiguous they were. All right, next time we do grab bags, they'll be Deathmate free. So, Capital City Publishing gave this book flop of the year. And many have speculated and said that it really was Deathmate more than anything else that led to the comic crash that was to come, that single-handedly ended the prosperous times that they've been experiencing. But honestly, there's plenty of blame to go around. And that brings us all the way back full circle to Marvel. Now, Marvel, we've already heard how great they were doing in 90 and 91, and even really going into 92. But with so many of their creators leaving for Image, with so much competition from high-profile projects, 93 was not so good for them. And in 93, in April of 93, they only placed 1 comic in the top 20. This was devastating news for Marvel. They were far too important, far too proud, and far too big of ego to put up with this. So they were going to push back. First thing they did was a lot of product. Characters like Venom got their own series, and oh look, shiny. And more series, and look, shiny. They did all sorts of specials, like every book that they could come up with, a 25th anniversary issue, a 50th, a 75th, a 100th, got a special cover, a double price sticker. They did everything they could. And they released a ton of books. In November of 1983, they produced 128 comics, just cover dated November. Again, that's a staggering amount, but they assumed that fans would buy all the Marvel comics first, and then if they had any money left over, they would buy Image and DC and Valiant, what have you. But they were wrong. They were absolutely wrong, and their books did not sell very well, and this was a huge blow for Marvel. One that would lead them to make a decision that would have colossal, huge, stupendous impact on the comic industry the very next year. And that is what we're going to cover in our next segment, because we've covered the boom. We're headed for a fall, and a fall like we had never, ever seen before. So guys, I've taken up enough of your time today. Come back for that one, please. Have a great day, and we'll see you then.